So in this presentation, we're going to look at the whole concept of thinking in general. In order to really grasp what is unique about creative thinking, it makes a lot of sense to sort of place it in the general realm of thinking, and especially the everyday thinking that we do um, as we go about our lives. Now, this is a huge topic, and this presentation is way too small to be able to do justice for it. But I'm going to focus on uh, sort of the way that we get ideas about the world and know about whether they're true or not. You know, the kind of thinking that impacts our opinions or our beliefs about people, world, events, things like that. And try and just kind of skirt around some of the bigger, larger issues or more complex, deeper issues relating to the topic. So, thinking itself can be placed within a larger category of mind. Mind could be placed in a larger category of consciousness, or maybe these two are reversed. This is not something we completely understand as a species right now. We know what it means to think. We all have thoughts, but defining sort of consciousness or where consciousness is, or what is the mind and what is the relationship between thinking and the mind, these are still questions that philosophers and scientists have been debating for a very long time and are still debating. This is not an easy thing. What are the differences and what are their relationships is not something that comes quite easily. What we can focus on are a few more specific and detailed things related to this idea of thinking. And so you might often come across words like this related to the process of thinking, or information, data, knowledge, understanding. All of these things are connected, appear somewhat related. Sometimes teasing out that relationship could be confusing because it's not always clear cut. There's a lot of overlap, and what people mean by these terms can vary from person to person. But I'm just going to lay out one schematic, one way of thinking about that. And that is this kind of pattern where data leads to information about things. Information leads to knowledge, to understanding, and eventually wisdom. This is just one way of laying it out and thinking about it. And so, by way of example, let's look at data. So, data might be, for instance, something like the eye detecting long wave light in the shape of a circle. So, light that has long wavelengths, and it's being detected by the eye, and its shape is a circle. So, this could be called data. This is just raw data. That data uh, then gets constructed into something we call information. And that information might be, I see a traffic light. Okay, so now that data makes sense. I'm informed by that data. What do I see? What is this red wavelength of light? Well, it's a traffic light. And that traffic light, that information, um, leads to the knowledge that the light is signaling for me to stop. All right, so I know what that light means. Okay, it means stop. And I understand why that light is there because it's part of a larger set of traffic signaling devices and rules that ensure that we as a species driving around can do so in an orderly and a safe way. So I understand, I know what I'm looking at, that I've got the information. And then hopefully all of that leads to some degree of wisdom, which might be framed something like this. Running through the traffic light might be dangerous, and I also might get a ticket. All right, so that's one way that we can kind of pull all this stuff together. But then there are other terms which pop up related to this. So intelligence, which is something we'll deal with in another presentation. But our opinions, our beliefs, the things that we know about the everyday world. So this is what we're going to focus on in this presentation. Beginning with the question, what do you know? What are the kinds of things that you know about the world? And how do you know that? How do you know that you know, and where do you get that knowledge from? These are, again, big questions, and we don't need to spend time sort of teasing them out. What I want to kind of narrow down on a little bit is, how do we come to know things? Where do we get our ideas from? The things that you have in your head about the world, about yourself, about people. How did you get that information, that knowledge, that wisdom, that understanding? Okay. There are basically three main areas. Experience. We experience the world in a particular way, which is very unique and specific to ourselves. Information, stuff we get from other people, ideas, knowledge, data, whatever, stuff we receive. Now, experience and information obviously overlap because I can have experiences that aren't mine by virtue of, say, for instance, being immersed in a novel or a movie where I start to see and feel and think about the world through the eyes and the experience of other people. So information and experience, two main sources, and then reasoning. We can think about the things that we think, and we can realize that there are conclusions we can come to, conclusions that are good conclusions or conclusions that are bad conclusions. So by virtue of just thinking about things, I can actually get ideas about the world and what's happening. But the important question is, how do we know that what we know is correct, that it's not an illusion, that it's not a trick, or that it's completely wrong or illusory? So how do we do this? Well, there are two main ways in which we tend to think about things. Well, there's actually many. You'll see what I mean in a minute. But if we're trying to think about how do we know something is true, how do we come to conclusions about the world, there are, generally speaking, two ways of doing this. One is to reason correctly, which is often referred to as deduction. And here the word reason is being used very specifically as a kind of logical, structural reasoning. And the other thing is we can make reasonable inferences about the world. We can draw conclusions about the world that seem to be somewhat reasonable. They might not be mathematically logical in the sense that deductive reasoning can be, but they serve as well. They get us by. And so these two groups, often referred to as deductive and inductive, or to deduce and infer, or formal reasoning and informal reasoning, are the kinds of things you might come up across in a sort of introduction to critical thinking logic class. The two main classes of how we go about trying to figure out what we know is correct and try to form ideas about the world that are reasonably correct. One of the big differences between the two is deductive reasoning tends to lead to conclusions that are fairly certain. They're right by virtue of the structure of the argument, and that's something I'll come to in a minute. It's not necessarily right in and of themselves that we sort of intuit their rightness, that the way that we deduce, the way that we logically structure the reasoning process will guarantee that what we're coming to is certain, either correct, incorrect, or they use different terms, which I'll talk about in a bit. Inductive reasoning, on the other hand, lacks certainty. It's more about probability. It seems like chances are this is more correct than that. All right. Now we'll find when we look at the way we go about the world, most of our thinking is inductive. In fact, 99% of it is. There's very little, unless we're working in certain professions, maybe mathematics, computer programming, things like that, where we're dealing with deductive reasoning. We go about our daily lives largely immersed in probability thinking or probabilistic thinking. So I'm going to start with deductive reasoning. It's got certain qualities. It's very abstract, doesn't always necessarily pertain to real situations of real people and things. And that's largely because it's not concerned so much about that. It's concerned about the structure of the argument, the way things are laid out. And mathematics is a good example. All right. It's sometimes referred to as symbolic logic. And like I said, it's not something we encounter, generally speaking, in everyday life. All right. One of the qualities of deductive reasoning is that it starts from premises, ideas, assumptions, basic assertions, propositions about the world that are very general and broad, and through the process of deduction comes to conclusions that are very, very specific, using a particular structure known as a logical deductive reasoning structure. So, for example, Here's a typical deductive reasoning argument. Here's two premises and a conclusion. So if you owned a hotel in Hawaii, if I owned it, I would be wealthy. If that was a premise, if that was a statement of uh, the way things are in this realm, and you did actually own a hotel in Hawaii, then therefore I must be wealthy. The question is this a true argument? So take a minute to think about it. And if you have, if you haven't, you can stop and keep thinking and turn the video back on. But if you have, you'll find that the answer is true. Yeah. And it's not possible for me to own a hotel in Hawaii and not be wealthy, because this premise, this state of affairs, if it exists, ensures that this conclusion has to be correct. So it has nothing to do with the reality of me being wealthy. It's saying if these situations do in fact hold, then this is the conclusion. And so it's a logical structure that takes me through, and the idea that I must be wealthy is beyond dispute. Now, in this kind of logic, the words true and false are not used. Your argument is either valid or invalid. And valid means it follows this structure, or invalid meaning the structure doesn't hold, it doesn't work. If it happens to be valid and these happen to be true, then we refer to it as sound. So there's a valid argument and a sound argument. How about this one? If I owned a hotel in Hawaii, I'd be wealthy. I am wealthy, therefore I own a hotel. Therefore, I own a hotel in Hawaii. Is this true? If you think about it, the answer has to be, the answer has to be invalid. Why? Because it's saying if I have a hotel, I'll be wealthy. But then it's not talking about the hotel, it's talking about being wealthy. There are more than many ways, to be wealthy. So if you are a wealthy person, it does not necessarily follow that you own a hotel in Hawaii. Okay, so you with me here? So this is an invalid structure. All right. You might be wealthy and you might own a hotel in Hawaii, but the argument that says, therefore, if this is true, premise one, and premise two is true, therefore the conclusion is true, does not follow. It is not a natural consequence of the premises that we're looking at. Similarly, how about this one? Is this a valid argument? Well, the answer is yes. If the premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. Okay? And this says all people do like it. Now, the reality is this is not true. And how do we know that? Well, we know it from experience. But even if we didn't, even if every Russian person we met or heard about or read about liked vodka, the idea that all people would like the same thing, if you think about it deductively and logically, doesn't make sense. Okay? So, this kind of argument does not follow. All right? How about this one? I'm sorry, going back, I made a mistake. This kind of argument does follow. All right, this one, same thing. It's a valid argument. Now, it's not true, so it's not sound, because my sister is not a unicorn, but if she was a unicorn, she would fly. And also, apparently, so far as we know, unicorns don't exist, and we don't know that all unicorns fly. So the premises are questionable as to whether they are true, but the structure of the argument is not in doubt. Now, this kind of thinking is endlessly fascinating, because these arguments can seem to be true or false regardless of whether they're valid or sound. So it's very easy to be tricked into thinking that something sounds logical when in fact it's not. And part of that is we just draw wrong conclusions from information. So let's have a look at this. Consider these facts. I'm not going to read them out to you. Okay. Okay. So is there a conclusion we can draw from this? Well, we can. Okay, so this is, a way of looking at correlation and then coming up with an absurd concept of causation. So correlation and causation are two different things, all right? Just because two things seem to go together does not necessarily mean that one causes the other, okay? And that's a big thing in our society. Very often, if we watch the news, television, read about what people are thinking or blogs, we've often come up with correlations. This happens and this happens, therefore there's a causal connection between things. And this is something we need to be on the guard against because they're not necessarily in a causal relationship just because they appear together all the time. So, for instance, there's a very high incidence of outdoor exercise, for instance, I'm sort of making this up, in skin cancer. Let's pretend there is. All right. If you look at how many people are working outside or exercising outside, and the incidence of skin cancer maybe being higher in this population, we might conclude that outdoor exercise causes skin cancer in the way that English causes the problems in the previous slide. But here we can see that the sun connects both of these things, right? But that's not necessarily the causal link between the two things, right? Skin cancer comes from the sun. Outdoor exercise has the sun involved, we hope, depending on where you live. But though these are all connected, it doesn't necessarily follow that these things are connected. So can you think of other examples? And you might want to just pause for a second the video and think, what other things do you come across maybe in your life and experience, or you've seen on TV or read in books, where you see there seems to be a causal connection between the things, just because there's actually only a correlation between things.